Hello, my name is Pharaoh Saunders with the Racial Justice Collaborative, and this is Advantage versus Adversity, opening the door to reparations dialogue. We're going to be talking about the foundations and the history of whiteness and what that means exactly at the very origin of the United States as a culture and as a country. Now, what really is the invention of whiteness? Oftentimes, when I talk to people about this concept, they talk about it as though it were a formulaic or purposefully invented process in order to determine what is white and what isn't. Whereas I find, like most things, this particular aspect in history was likely much more organic and was based around a sort of unspoken sense of what was most like the dominant group. And like most civilizations, the United States, when it was founded, was built around a core original ethnic group in terms of what the core citizenry of that culture and country was to be, which was English Protestant. Now, that's important because there were multiple factors as to what was considered factors that would allow certain groups to be seen as most similar or most alike to the English. And those were multiple things, such as language, not necessarily the same language, but recognizable language, language of similar linguistic origin to English. There are also the two prime important factors, those being religion, which were other groups of the Protestant faith, and the most important one, which still to this day in modern times is the most important one, which is the skin color itself being white. Because as time would go on and more of these other factors of exclusion would slowly get eroded and lost over time, that one is one that remains to be of prime importance in modern time. Manifest destiny is a very important concept in American history, and it relates strongly to this sense of inclusion and the specific factors of what allows certain groups to be included or excluded. Specifically, in reference to manifest destiny, the factor of religion is very important, as it was a religious rallying cry that advocated for Americans across the entirety of the now continental United States, walking all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast in search of new land. The majority of Americans, and especially European immigrants coming to the Americas, did so for the promise of land, land that they never could have had in Europe, for the land in Europe had been controlled by certain households and certain families for literally centuries. And now there is an entirely new land open to be taken by new people. However, by the time of Manifest Destiny and when that started to become more and more of a prospect, the United States had its wealthy elite on the East Coast. It had its land taken up and owned in the Northeast and the Southeast, and those cultures had already been developed. And so, in order for new cultures, in order for new lands and new people to make their way, they had to reach westward to the unclaimed lands in order to continue to spread and in order to continue to be able to claim new land for their lives and for their families. And it was seen as divinely inspired that these Americans, both old and new, would be able to spread out westward across the continent in order to do just that. Now, scientific racism is something that branches out from that because, like we had mentioned, Manifest Destiny was a very religiously inspired concept. It was a very religious based motivation and morale for why they were able to continue to spread out and conquer all those groups that were in the way, all the Native American peoples, etc. And so, as the Western world continued to develop and modernize, and as science became more and more important to the individual daily lives of Westerners, and more important to motivation as to why things should be as they are in the natural world, it stands to reason that it was important that there was a development and specific scientific or pseudoscientific, in this case, not properly scientific, but simply a justification with the guise of being based in physical science for why the white race was superior to all others that would follow in their step. There are all manner of specific programs and schools of thought that were based around these different pseudosciences that were put in place in order to allow for the white race to have its continued cultural and economic dominance over all others around it. Specifically, the School of Eugenics, which was a process of selective breeding in order to emphasize the importance of desirable traits, was one of particular importance. These desirable traits that were to be reinforced were, of course, things like fine hair texture, white skin, light eyes, things like that, narrow noses. These were things that were seen as right and proper. And specifically, these things in the American eugenics program would go on to influence and become the literal inspiration for the Nazi German eugenics program that would follow shortly after. The history of racial terror and lynching in the United States is something that sprouted from the 13th Amendment and the aftermath of the Civil War, in which Black people, now recently endowed with citizenship and by legal standing, human rights, were met with fierce and violent backlash in order to attempt to, through fear and targeted violence, like all terrorism, force them to capitulate to a specific standard that was well below any meaningful standard or rightful standard for any human being, especially not one granted those legal rights by the very constitution of the country they live in. Through this fear and terror, Black people were supposed to be forced into this lower standing in society, this significantly lesser position. But through all of it, African Americans were able to stand firmly and resiliently against those positions that were attempted to be forced upon them. And with that, the racial divide would continue to grow stronger and stronger as a white rage would continue to develop and build in the face of this Black resistance. It's important to understand how everything in which we have described so far in regards to the history of the original colonial mindsets, the religious mindset, the pseudoscientific mindset, and the terror that was inflicted upon African Americans, all of this was either perfectly legal or there was very little in the way of legal recourse that African Americans could take in the face of any of this. And a long-standing legal construct that allowed for much of this to continue for a lot of the history of the United States was legal segregation, which wouldn't be confronted or overturned until after the Supreme Court would overturn the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which allowed for this legal segregation to persist in the United States for so long, allowing for much of the way of future change to continue to develop and eventually spread into the United States, a continually developing process. This has been Pharaoh Saunders with the Racial Justice Collaborative, Advantage versus Adversity, opening the door to reparation dialogue, and I hope you enjoy the following presentation.